Yahweh appeared to Abraham by the oak grove of Mamre, while Abraham sat at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Looking up, Abraham saw 3 travelers standing nearby. When he saw them, Abraham ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass by our tent. Let some water be brought, that you may bathe your feet, and then rest yourselves beneath this tree. As you have come to your faithful one, let me bring you a little food, that you may refresh yourselves. Afterward, you may go on your way." "Very well," they replied. "Do as you have said." Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick! Take a bushel of fine flour and knead it into loaves of bread." Abraham then ran to the herd, selected a choice and tender calf, and sent a worker hurrying to prepare it. Then Abraham took cheese and milk and the calf which had been prepared and placed it before the travelers. And he waited on them under the tree while they ate. "Where is Sarah?" they asked. "There in the tent," Abraham replied. One of them said, "I will surely return to you this time next year, and Sarah will then have a child." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent just behind him. Now Sarah and Abraham were old, well on in years, and Sarah no longer had menstruation. So Sarah laughed to herself and said, "Now that I am so old and my husband even older, is pleasure to come my way again?" Yahweh said to Abraham, "Why does Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really deliver a child at my age?' Is anything too extraordinary for God to do? At the appointed time, at this time next year, I will return to you, and Sarah will have a child." Sarah was afraid and said, "I didn't laugh." God said, "Oh, but you did indeed laugh." A reading from chapter 21. Yahweh was gracious to Sarah as it had been foretold and did what had been promised. Sarah conceived and gave birth to a child for Abraham, who is now in old age at the time God had promised. They named the child Isaac, and Abraham circumcised the child Isaac when he was 8 days old, according to God's command. Abraham was 100 years old when Sarah gave birth to Isaac. Laughter. For Sarah said, "Now God has given me laughter, and all who hear this will laugh with me." You've heard the scripture, and I had a pre-recorded sermon that I thought yesterday as I was preparing was lost. And in fact, it wasn't. But thinking about it more, realized that I'd rather speak to you directly from my heart. And so that is what I am going to do. So this book of Genesis is the beginning, the narrative. And the story of Abraham and Sarah is the beginning of God's chosen people, the calling on Abram and Sarai to leave the land that they knew, to travel to unknown places, gave us example of faithfulness. And also the promise that God had made to Abraham, Abram actually, to be the father of all nations, that all the descendants would come from him, and yet it wasn't realized because they were in their older age. And after trying to get around this promise, Sarah had tried to fulfill this with her, with Hagar and Ishmael. And so that's part of the history. And so I want to be careful and know that that the story is hard, particularly because it talks about barrenness, inability to have children. And I am sensitive that there are circumstances of folks within our own faith community who didn't have children, and that's okay. And in the time of Abraham and Sarah, a woman's value is based on her ability to produce offspring, because that was who was passed. Wealth and inheritance were passed on to future generations through children. And Sarah was part of this promise through God and Abraham, and here she was, standing on the tent edges and playing host to 3 strangers who came and was invited into that space by Abraham. And Abraham asked her to prepare bread and called out to their servants to prepare meat for these guests as a sign of hospitality and welcome. And they did that. And in the breaking of the bread, the fellowship of strangers in that space, one of the strangers said to Abraham, in 1 year's time, I'll come back and you will have a child. Now that would have echoed in Abraham's ears because he had had a conversation with God previously where God said, you will be the father of nations. And Abraham laughed at God. And God said, who are you to know what is possible and what is impossible? And so Sarah overhears this stranger to say that they would have a child within a year's time. And she said, in this old age, you're going to give me a child? And she laughs. It makes me think about how sometimes when there's a really awkward situation, we often use laughter to diffuse it as a shield. And I know I'm guilty of saying this, and I'm sure folks have said it to me, and it's been, I'm not laughing at you, I'm laughing with you. And in this case, in Sarah's first response, I'm pretty sure she's laughing at the stranger. Because laughter is a social connection that infants as early as 3 months are able to laugh, even before they're able to communicate with words and sentences. So there's something about laughter that connects us together in a community. And reading in Scientific American, there was a quote that said that laughter is the signal of connection likely to play an essential role in our survival. And when we meet a stranger, we really want to know, what are your intentions with me? And who else are you aligned with? And so Sarah's laughter in this case is laughter at what the stranger said as a way of saying, who are you, stranger, to tell me that this is actually going to happen? And who are you with to say this to me? Because I can imagine Sarah in those moments saying that this was a promise made by God and it's not yet been fulfilled. And if I hear this, it brings both pain and disappointment and anxiousness and frustration. And are you serious? I'm old. How am I going to have a baby? And God responds. And God said, Sarah, why'd you laugh? And she says, I didn't laugh. And God calls her out and says, you absolutely did laugh. Who are you to think that what is possible and what is impossible? And so that's that break point with the strangers. Now fast forward a whole year, and later in chapter 21 in Genesis, we hear that Abraham and Sarah do have a child. Sarah gives birth to her son, Isaac. And Isaac in the scriptures, the Hebrew language, means laughter. And so in naming this child, Isaac, laughter, Sarah converts her laughing at those comments from the stranger to laughing with God. That there's been a transition in the laughter between that moment and a year later. And there is something for us to sit with that.
that the laughter at the beginning was a shield to protect Sarah from all of the emotions that were involved with not being able to have a child, to then having the ultimate joy of her son Isaac. And this week in your study guide, you're going to see that there's a piece of artwork created by Hannah Garrity. Make sure I said her name right. Yeah. And it looks like this. Now this painting is called The Heir. The heir as in H-E-I-R. That child right there will be the heir to the promise of God made to Abraham. And Sarah looks upon this child, Isaac, as the gift, as a gift of joy. So this week, I'd like you to spend a little bit of time with that piece of art. It's in your study journal. I will produce a video of Visio Divina, a guided prayer process through the art. Our takeaway from scripture this morning is the fact that Sarah's laughter at first is a sign, an outward indication of how disconnected and unraveled her life felt. And wondering, is there even a possibility for it to come back together again? And then when we see her a year later, we see how God has woven her back and brought her back together and giving her the gift of joy. So this week, it's really hard to laugh because there's so much going on. That our world seems to be unraveling. So the question is, how will God weave things back together? I have a really hard time saying reweave into something new. That God's not done with us, and that God will continue to use us, the moments of our lives, for greater purpose. So let us reflect on that this week.
Give us laughter unexpected, mirth and mothers us to help, bubbling up from deep within us, endless source of wondrous wealth. May our tears is you.